Going via Zoom to New South Wales to catch up with Bill Bowtell, who's an adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales, and more importantly, a strategic health policy consultant, and one who has not only consulted governments here and now, but in the past, especially when the last great scourge was HIV, and you had a big hand, Bill Bowtell, at that time, to say to the government, we needed to get the message out quickly, we needed to have one strong message, and we needed to repeat it over and over again, and the message got through. What did we do wrong this time with an equally big message that had to get out when we discovered that a global pandemic was coming our way, in fact, had arrived on our shores?
Well, there was a lot of confusion at the beginning. As we entered December of this extremely strange and funny year, I can at least say that Australia and New Zealand, after quite a lot of confusion in Australia and a bit of pain and agony, it's got to be said, we've come to a very good conclusion to the year. Effectively, all the governments of Australia and New Zealand have adopted the idea that we want local elimination of the virus, and that's what we've achieved. So that's a tremendous thing, and it's very different than the rest of the world. We've only got to look at what's going on in Europe and the United Kingdom and terribly in the United States to realise the consequences of not taking the swift action at the beginning that we did broadly, and used all the behavioural things that we had to do, stopping moving around the country, being inside, using masks, doing all of those things that created a lot of disruption and pain, but far less disruption and pain than is now being caused and suffered in those countries that decided they could live with it and now are paying a terrible price this Christmas. So I'm pretty happy we're in a better place for Christmas 2020 than a lot of our friends and neighbours overseas.
Bill, should we be using eradication or should we be talking about suppression? Go on.
There is no such thing as aggressive suppression or living with the virus or learning to cope with it. This was the big mistake that was made, I've got to say, in Victoria about April, May, when they opened up and really opened up. They threw caution to the winds that first time when they still had, from memory, like 15 cases more around metropolitan Melbourne that were going on, excuse me, that they didn't suppress, that they didn't eliminate. And when they did that, they then had weeks of deciding they would have postcode lockdowns. They would run around Melbourne and see where it was a few weeks ago and hope that they would contain it. And of course, that led straight to that exponential growth curve of new cases in Melbourne, not in Sydney or in Brisbane or in Perth, but in Melbourne. And that's what took the 15 weeks or so of the lockdown. So I think the experience of this year proves conclusively that the only way to live with this thing is to live without it. Now, you do that in the emergency phase when the thing comes onto you, and you say, if we can stop it before it starts, before it really takes hold, as we did in most of Australia and New Zealand, but not Victoria, if we do that, we can smash it down, put it out of business, get to 0-0, and that gives us the breathing space until we get the better treatments or the vaccines or the things that I'm glad to see are coming down the track next year. So we've had this year or so between when it first emerges and when we have better treatments and hopefully vaccines and things that will mitigate the damage and put us in a better position.
Bill, I also should note, and most people should note, that Victoria has not taken any overseas visitors in all that time, while Sydney has kept its international terminal open and it's brought Australians back who wanted to come back. Victoria, of course, when it got into that trouble, said, no one's coming to our... Now, things have changed. We've suddenly got arrivals now making their way to Melbourne Airport. Are we going to be any better off this time round? Have we learnt anything, do you think, from the mistakes that were being made not that long ago?
I really hope so. I have immense faith in the people who run our public health system, the people on the front line, the people who are working every day and night to care for people who are ill, to prevent illness becoming a problem, all of those contact tracing and everything. So I believe we have the people. We've got to have the right systems though when it comes to quarantine. And we saw there was a big problem with Ruby Princess. The quarantine arrangements that should have governed the docking of that ship and looking after the people who are infected on that ship fell apart. The virus got in the cracks between the federal government, the state government, and a whole alphabet soup of agencies that were supposed to be responsible, but in the end, nobody was responsible. And those people were sent around Australia. So the quarantine becomes immensely important because as the internal borders come down, which is a good thing, so we can all go and see our families and friends for Christmas and the New Year, the first and only line of defence between us and New Zealand and the rest of the world, where we've got the best part of 1 million cases a day, the only line of defence is the quarantine arrangements. And that's at Melbourne Airport, Sydney Airport, Brisbane Airport, of course. So when people come in, they've got to be processed properly. And next year, I think we're going to be looking at a very large increase in the numbers of people who want to come to Australia. There are still too many Australians overseas, and they have a right to come home. So we've got to upgrade our systems to make sure that we can handle them now. Visitors, compassionate people travelling for compassionate reasons, overseas students. We've got to have a situation where we can scale up the numbers of people coming through quarantine, but we want to let them in, but we don't want to let the virus in. That's the only point I'd make.
Have we learnt anything from our aircraft companies? Have the air carriers learnt anything in the last 8-9 months other than no flights and now some flights?
Look, I think the airlines have, from anecdotally from friends I've had who've travelled, I think the airlines have got this going pretty well. I noticed that Alan Joyce at Qantas was saying that see how the vaccines go, but having a vaccine certificate may be a prerequisite for whenever international travel from Australia starts up again. So I think that's right. The question is what happens when people turn up at the airports. And we've seen in Sydney in the last couple of days a very regrettable incident. There was confusion. There was a low junior police officer who seemingly made an error, but it wasn't his fault. It was the fault of a system that should be functioning so much better than it was. And those people who came in evidently were very well minded. They were expecting to go to quarantine, but somehow or another they got on a flight to Melbourne and were walking around Melbourne Airport saying, where are we going to quarantine?
Bill Bowtell, the reason I was asking you about airlines is because we have an Australian Tennis Open, huge event, and it's going to see 1,500 tennis players and their entourage seemingly descend on Victoria and Melbourne. Can you see a problem?
Well, it's a bit like the Grand Prix. Remember, there was a big kerfuffle this year, right at the last moment. The Premier cancelled the Grand Prix, wisely in my view. So it looks like the Open will be the first big international event we're going to have in a year. So I think all the systems have to be up and running. The testing, the quarantine, the surveillance, the tracking and tracing, all of that has to be working really well. I'm sure the authorities have got this in mind. I don't think anybody in Australia now, from the top of the government to all the people, want to see any recurrence of this virus. So I think the organisers of the Open, the governments, they're on notice. The people have given their direction, 0-0. So if you're going to hold a big event, let's welcome the tennis players and their entourages, but not the coronavirus. So all the eyes of all Australians will be on how well our systems work. And it's no use after the event blaming a lower down person on the totem pole for not doing this or that. All that means is the systems were not running as they ought to.
Bill
So,
Bowtell,
we'll be watching with interest.
very strong words, very much on point. We thank you very much for giving us a bit of background and your assessment and analysis on just how we've coped over the last 8 or 9 months and how much we've learned. Once again, let me take this opportunity to wish you all the best for Christmas, and we look forward to catching up with you again in the new year.
And thank you to you and all your team there for all you've done. It's been very important to have these channels to get out the message and to discuss what has been a most extraordinary year. I just hope that the new year is a little bit quieter and more tranquil and we get back to something a bit like normal. Thank you.
Bill Bowtell, thank you very much for joining us. Bill Bowtell on The Informer.